After President Eisenhower, who was very popular, was leaving office, there was a hotly contested presidential election between Eisenhower's vice president, Richard Nixon, and Senator John F. Kennedy from Massachusetts. Senator Kennedy wins in a very, very close election, and this presentation is really about his few years in office before he was assassinated. Here is one of the most famous John F. Kennedy quotes from his inaugural address in 1961. Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. Very, very famous quote of his. Kennedy's domestic agenda becomes known as the New Frontier. Some of his goals were to provide federal funds for urban renewal, really meaning the rebuilding of infrastructure in major cities. He also wanted an increase in the minimum wage to $1.25 an hour. Clearly, the value of the U.S. currency was very different back then because that seems like a very low figure to us today. Federal funds to aid impoverished families, federal funds for public education, Medicare, which was a public health insurance for the elderly idea, and civil rights legislation to guarantee black rights. Some of his goals are achieved. Others had to be taken up by Lyndon Johnson, his vice president, after Kennedy's assassination in 1963. One of the things Kennedy was able to achieve before he was killed is the Peace Corps. He created this organization to encourage public service, particularly service to impoverished nations overseas in places like Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We increased literacy rates through education and also the basics like healthcare, clean water. Those are great goodwill efforts that the Peace Corps offers. The nations that we're describing here are third world nations. We already learned that term back when we were learning about the Eisenhower presidency, that first world nations were really Western European and the United States and Canada, fully industrial, fully developed nations. Second world nations would be the Soviet Union and China. They aren't fully industrialized, but they're developing. And then third world nations, like those we're referring to on this slide, are nations that are very underdeveloped and need a lot of aid from nations like the United States. The space race. Not only had the Soviets launched Sputnik in 1957, but they also put the first man into space in 1961. His name was Yuri Gagarin. The U.S. lifted Alan Shepard into space within a month of Gagarin, but Kennedy was tired of seeing NASA fall short of the Soviets. So he announces right in his inaugural address that he intended for NASA to land a man on the moon before the end of the decade. So he's creating a competition between the United States and the Soviet Union because he's really sick and tired of falling short of what the Soviets are doing in space. Kennedy didn't live to see it, but the U.S. does land Apollo 11 on the moon in 1969. Astronauts Buzz Aldrin and Neil Armstrong become the first men to walk on the moon. You see in these photographs, to the left, a professional portrait of Neil Armstrong, and to the right, Neil Armstrong taking his first steps onto the moon in 1969. The Berlin Wall. We talked about all of the things that were increasing tension between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Truman and Eisenhower presidencies, but things only continued to get worse under President Kennedy. The Vienna Conference in June 1961 saw Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev and President Kennedy butting heads very badly over East and West Berlin. This leads, a couple of months later, to the Soviet Union constructing a concrete wall to separate East Berlin from West Berlin. This is in August 1961. And the main goal is to prevent East Berliners from escaping to West Berlin. So escaping the grip of communism. The Bay of Pigs. Fidel Castro, aided by Che Guevara, took power in Cuba in 1959 after a communist coup d'etat of the democratically elected government of Cuba. Kennedy supported a rebel Cuban group and trained them for an invasion via the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency. But when the invasion actually took place in April 1961, he refused to provide air support, which would be bombs from U.S. planes, in support of the Cuban refugee soldiers going ashore. Without the air support, the Cuban invasion was an absolute miserable failure. And this is a major embarrassment for the Kennedy administration after not being in office for more than a few months. You can see here some of the major figures involved in the Bay of Pigs. Cuban leaders Fidel Castro on the bottom left, also a modern picture of him, bottom center. His crony friend Che Guevara on the bottom right, and a picture of President Kennedy at a press conference in the upper right. And you can see on this map, which is actually meant to show you a few of the missile sites during the Cuban Missile Crisis. We will come back to that. You can see those missile sites here, here, and here. But you can also see where the Bay of Pigs invasion took place in 1961, and it was such a miserable failure due to President Kennedy's refusal to provide air support. Although Fidel Castro is quite famous and well known today, not a lot of people really know a lot about Che Guevara. Che Guevara was really a ruthless man who, after taking control of Cuba, would unilaterally have people executed for even just the slightest of rumors. If you were to ask Senora Romeo to tell you about growing up in and eventually escaping from Cuba, she would tell you that she had personal family friends who lost spouses or brothers to killings ordered by Che Guevara. He was a very ruthless man, quite honestly, an awful person in general. He is remembered today on t-shirts that people tend to like to wear that say Viva la Revolucion under this very image of his face. The problem is people wear that thinking it's saying, yeah, I'm a rebel and I don't allow any authority over myself. Same concept as Confederate flag bumper stickers and things like that. It's very insulting. The Confederate flag stands for the Confederacy, for slavery, racism in general, so that's insulting to minority populations. Well, the t-shirts of Che Guevara's face are insulting to people like Senora Romeo, who lived through the horrors of Che Guevara, Fidel Castro, and communist Cuba. So people should really think twice before they promote the image of Che Guevara. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962. The Soviet Union had nuclear missiles in Cuba. The only way the U.S. finds out about it is via U-2 spy plane missions over Cuba. They discover that these have been snuck in right under their nose. The U.S. demands removal of the missiles, and as things begin to heat up and get a little more tense, JFK orders a quarantine of Cuba. I put that in quotes because the word quarantine is used very carefully. Because to use the word blockade, that's an act of war, and the Soviets could respond militarily. To use the word quarantine very carefully words the situation. So if there is an aggressive act taken by the Soviets, that the United States would not shoulder any of the blame for the violence that would erupt afterwards. Eventually, a secret deal is struck. JFK's brother, Bobby Kennedy, is his attorney general. And Bobby goes to the Soviet embassy in Washington, and he sits down with the Soviet ambassador to the United States. And they hash out a plan where the Soviets would remove missiles from Cuba. Meanwhile, the U.S. would guarantee never to invade Cuba, as well as remove their nuclear missiles from Turkey in Europe, which were about the same distance from the Soviet Union as Cuba is from the United States. Now, this deal was not made public at the time because it would make the United States look like they were negotiating with an unreasonable enemy in the Soviet Union. So they kept this deal very secret. It's hinted at in Bobby Kennedy's book, 13 Days, and it is even more accurately described in a movie based on Bobby Kennedy's book with some additions of declassified information about the Cuban Missile Crisis that does discuss this deal made with the Soviets. Secretary of Defense at the time, Bob McNamara, he sits down with Fidel Castro for lunch in the 1990s, and they kind of remember the Cuban Missile Crisis, they're discussing it, and McNamara casually mentions, Sir, what would you have done had we decided to invade Cuba? Because that was one of the options on the table for the United States, was a military option to invade. And Castro says, well, I would have fired the missiles. And McNamara says, well, none of those missiles were yet operational, were they? And Castro says, very much so were they operational, and we absolutely would have fired them had you decided to invade. And McNamara says, well, you realize that Cuba would have been totally destroyed if you did that. We would have wiped Cuba off the map with our own nuclear weapons. And Castro says, I understand. We still would have fired the missiles. And so you think about what people knew in 1962 and shortly thereafter, a lot of that was still classified. And we certainly didn't know that the missiles were operational. So McNamara says that for the remainder of that lunch, he had a lump in his throat because as close as we were on the brink of nuclear war. He realized we were even that much closer than he, as the Secretary of Defense, really realized. So that's pretty scary business. Here is a reconnaissance photograph showing the missile sites in Cuba. And this is really the only way that the United States knew that the Soviets had missiles snuck into Cuba, is through this reconnaissance and U-2 spy planes. Kennedy escalates the United States' involvement in Vietnam. Throughout the Eisenhower presidency, military aid had been sent in the form of weapons and money, but the French had lost at Dien Bien Phu in 1954. This is only a couple of years after President Eisenhower is elected president. So there's very little help from the French in trying to maintain democracy in this Indo-Chinese colony. The French abandon it and leave. Now, the independent nations of Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam are all struggling at this point between communist forces and democratic forces that want to gain control of the government. Eisenhower supports South Vietnam, again, with only aid of weapons and money. Kennedy steps up the U.S. involvement and escalates to the point of U.S. advisors. And I put that in quotes because advisors are really boots on the ground with the South Vietnamese army, training them, teaching them tactics, but yes, fighting alongside them. So these advisors are actually U.S. soldiers fighting alongside the South Vietnamese. So this is a major escalation. You can see here President Kennedy speaking in a press conference, and he's referring to a map of Laos. You can see here North Vietnam. South Vietnam would be slightly off the map, but some of it can be seen here. Cambodia can be seen here. But he is referring to Laos. And Laos, particularly the area he has outlined in two different shades of gray, was home to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which was a supply chain going all along the Vietnamese border in Laos and even stretched down into Cambodia. And the reason this is important is because no matter what the United States tries to do in Vietnam, according to international law, the United States has no authority to bomb inside of Laos and Cambodia. So the North Vietnamese communists simply utilize the Ho Chi Minh Trail just across the border, making many of their supplies untouchable by the United States military. And it isn't until the late 60s and early 70s that President Nixon, who takes over when Lyndon Johnson decides not to run for re-election in 1968, authorizes missions that technically violate international law into these areas, bombing many of these areas, because he thinks that he is saving American troops' lives. But this is being discussed even back in March 1961 by President Kennedy. Finally, Dallas in 1963. Kennedy and his wife, Jackie, are traveling through Dallas preparing for the 1964 presidential campaign. They're trying to win over the hearts and minds of Texas Democrats. Although Kennedy is a Democrat, he is a very different kind of Democrat than the party has traditionally supported. Texas is a very traditional Democratic state at this time, so he really needs to try to win over the hearts and minds of Texans. So he visits Dallas in 1963, and Lee Harvey Oswald shoots and kills him in his presidential motorcade. He also injures Texas Governor John Connally, who was riding in the presidential limousine with President Kennedy. There are many, many conspiracy theories. However, modern ballistic tests that are shown in many documentaries that came out in the year 2013, the 50th anniversary of the assassination, these show that it was very possible that Oswald indeed acted alone and that the magic bullet theory, which I'll come back to in a moment, was true. You can see photography here in the upper left before the shooting started of the presidential motorcade moving through Dallas. You can see the president, you can see Mrs. Kennedy, and you can see Governor Connally, and although a little obstructed, you can see his wife. While driving through, they make a turn into what's known as Dealey Plaza. The limousine slows down to the point where Lee Harvey Oswald can get off accurate shots at Kennedy. You can see in this photo on the bottom left how President Kennedy is slumped over from having been hit by the first bullet, and Mrs. Kennedy is checking on him here. You can also see Governor Connally, who has leaned to his left because the bullet that has gone through Kennedy has also struck him. One of the conspiracy theories is this area of the photo here. If it's blown up, shows what many people refer to as badge man. And when I say badge man, I mean people claim that a man disguised as a Dallas police officer is hiding in this area of the photograph known as the grassy knoll area, and that there must have been a second gunman there for some of what happened to have happened. Like I said, there are many modern documentaries and modern ballistic tests that have shown this is probably not true. But the conspiracy theory nonetheless comes from when zooming in on this photograph, you can see what appears to be the contour of a man's face here, his hairline, his ear, his eyes here, and what looks to be possibly a muzzle flash, as well as the reflection of his badge as he poses to be a Dallas police officer. Now, if I'm to clear off what I just circled, you can see again that this does somewhat resemble the contours of a man. That is the end of the presentation. Please make sure that you go back to the website and take the online quiz. Use your notes. If you use your notes, there's really no reason why you shouldn't get a perfect score. Thank you. See you in class.